Well, Damon, good news. I just talked to a couple friends of mine, and interestingly enough, they said, hey, we're game to compare 991 versus 992 Carrera T. So we're going to head over to my friend Gary's house, and he just took delivery of a 992 Carrera T. And another good friend of mine, David, has a 991.2 Carrera T. And he said, hey, let's do some driving and swap cars and get their feedback. So I figured I'd pull out of the garage in a 992 GT3 Touring. It's kind of a comparison because a lot of people wonder, you know, is a 992 Carrera T kind of a baby GT3? So I'll have sort of fresh opinions. So
yep.
Let's jump in this car and drive over there.
Be sure to log into your YouTube account, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a video.
Oh, I love that engine note, even at these slow speeds.
The one thing I will say about a GT3, and I'll reserve my judgment, I haven't driven a 992 Carrera T. I've driven a 991 Carrera T quite a bit, but not a 992, so I'll reserve judgment. But the one thing I can historically tell you, the GT3s always manage to feel like a sense of occasion. Like it feels just a little bit special, and it's that exhaust note. There's just a coarseness into it and kind of an edge.
Yeah.
That's it's hard to describe, but it feels Porsche managed it. It's kind of funny how they take essentially similar basic chassis and they manage to imbue such unique personality into each one.
Yep.
And it's interesting, it's not necessarily good or bad in each of the versions, it's just different. And so depending on what you're wanting to do, but again, these cars manage to feel special. And again, my primary love is classic Porsche. I'll put that out there. You know, modern Porsche to me is so good, so capable, so fast that I don't feel like I can really safely explore it, both in terms of, you know, keeping my license and keeping my insurance, but also, you know, what's reasonable and prudent on a public road, as well as, let's be honest, what's reasonable and prudent for given my driving experience and skills.
Yeah.
We all tend to think we're better drivers than we are, and these cars remind me that I could keep tuning those skills up for sure. You do have little things like there's a grade here. I can't see it in the video, but we'll scrape. I would have to activate my front axle lift if I really wanted to be safe there.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Exhaust note is definitely one area where the T is going to struggle compared to the GT3.
Yep. I'll confirm that. You know, it doesn't sound, you know, with the 992 at least, doesn't sound quite as good as this. And I'm not quite sure if you're going to get near redline. What I've noticed with any 992 coupe with a 3-liter flat 6 twin turbo, or a Cabriolet or Targa if the roof is closed, when you're on that last 500 or so RPM, the sound changes for the better. It's like a buzzsaw almost.
Yeah.
And I love it, but it really can't match this car.
No, I mean, normal aspiration for the win in terms of sound. The turbocharged cars are nice as a daily because, again, we talked about this, I think, earlier in another car we were driving. You know, torque is really what gets the job done in kind of your day-to-day cut and mix and regular traffic.
Yeah.
And so they're pretty eminently usable. Even just a little bit of dampness on the road, we got just a little bit of squirrel out of that.
Yeah, I felt that one a little bit.
I thought, okay, better be a little judicious, Nathan. My insurance agent will not like me if I call and say, sir, you just bought yourself a 992 GT3 Touring. That probably wasn't on his to-do list for the day, so.
Yeah. Yeah, the one thing about the GT3 and GT3 Touring is one of the key differences in the suspension. I'm sure there's a lot of differences in tuning, you know, the shocks or different springs, but the GT3 has monoball or spherical ball joints in the suspension. Not any rubber, I don't believe, or very, very little.
They have some, but yeah.
They have some.
Minimal.
Minimal.
By comparison. So yeah, it's, you know, every input is just a little bit more direct. I mean, when you take, rubber out of the suspension, you just have just a millisecond delay as that transfer over, which in daily use can actually be a good thing, right? It makes it a little bit less hyperactive.
Yeah.
It certainly makes it more compliant. But at the ragged edge, that's one of the subtle ways you give a car that edgy, quick feeling. It's almost as if you have the thought and the car's already making the motion.
Yeah.
There's no lag in any input.
Yeah.
But yeah, the one thing that does amaze me about modern Porsche, I still just am amazed, is that, this car has a performance envelope that's truly mind-boggling. Yet, I could lend this car to my mother-in-law and she could drive it.
Yeah.
Right? It's not. Even as recently as, for example, a 997 GT3, it's a pretty edgy car. That's a car that would be pretty hard to deal with in a kind of an urban environment and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
This car, it's as docile.
Yeah.
Probably I think the crossover is maybe like about as docile as a regular 997. So just a couple generations back on a more of a street-oriented 911.
Yeah. I would say that, maybe I have a little more sensitive of a behind, but I always thought that the GT3 for me would be a little stiff to be comfortable for daily use, at least in Baltimore. I'm not quite sure about out here.
Yeah, I live in the suburbs, more kind of on the edge of suburban, kind of rural, where road quality is a little better. My brother, for example, lives right in urban Seattle. His roads are brutal.
Yeah.
I would not drive this car to his house. I would lose a filling or two in the process. I will say the best steering of any modern Porsche is in this car. They got the weighting just right. In fact, one of the, I'm well known for my pet peeves, but one of them, which is, and you and I both fall in this camp, so we can be guilty of this. The automotive journalists like to, oh my gosh, the hydraulic steering.
Yeah.
I'm here to tell you, there's nothing about this electric rack that you could put a candle to on a hydraulic. They absolutely have this down to a science.
Yeah, you feel everything in that, all the grains, just like in the old days, right? Old days saying, 10, 15 years ago being old.
Well, it's even like, again, it's drizzling a little bit here in Seattle, and it's a little bit cooler out, so the roads are a little bit damp. I got to be a little careful on our rubber, 48 degrees. But I still feel like I can feel the texture on the road, and I can feel just a little bit of that slip angle in it, and it's really remarkable. Whereas I've driven some other cars, I don't want to say their names out loud, but they might have three initials that start with a B. Those cars, you drive those cars, and particularly where I want to feel where the front wheels are doing, like when it's damp out or traction's a little more limited, and I just feel like what's being communicated to me is not an accurate representation of the surface. And with these cars, man, I don't have that sensation at all.
Yeah.
There was a period of time where, I hate to say it, I felt like the best shifting of all the modern Porsche were the mid-engine cars. And the 992 is the first gen that I feel like this is every bit as precise as what I was feeling, for example, in the Cayman GT4 or Boxster Spider. Whereas the regular, really the first ones that started to kind of be a thorn in my side were the 7-speed introduced in the 991 regular cars. They just felt a little bit imprecise, and you could get the wrong gate. Maybe that's the whole 7-speed element.
Yeah.
But this car,
Those 7-speed transmissions, they're basically converted PDK transmissions, and from what I've learned is there's a lot of wizardry going on in those transmissions to make a PDK box work in a manual format. So the 7-speeds feel maybe a little more rubbery in the sense that, and this is not a great comparison, but how a 944 shifter feels rubbery compared to a contemporary 911.
okay.
It's not that big of a difference, but, that's the best way I can describe it.
It's funny. I have a 944 turbo. I think you know that. And I would absolutely describe the shift feel in that car as rubbery, but maybe because I grew up driving a 944, I find it kind of comforting in that car, and I would never describe that I want a car to feel rubbery when it shifts, but the 944 absolutely is rubbery. I think maybe because it quells that vibration of the torque tube. And this should look familiar. This is the scene of the, we jokingly call it the 3.2 Carrera Ranch. We filmed our 3.2 Carrera video here. Well, we've arrived at my friend Gary's house, and I have something exciting to share with you. If you were watching earlier, we drove this 992 GT3 Touring over because we wanted to see how it compared to a 992 Carrera T, as well as a 991.2 Carrera T. And what's even more exciting, I'm going to drive both these cars, share my thoughts, but more importantly, the owners of these cars have agreed to swap keys, and they're going to give their own driving experiences. What do they think? The 992 owner, Gary, he's going to tell you what he thinks of David's 991.2 and vice versa. So hold on. We haven't found this content anywhere online. Stay tuned. Well, we just drove over to Gary's house in the 992 GT3 Touring, and the first thing I'm most excited about this car, and it sounds dumb, but you can't tell this in the video, but it's currently 45 degrees and raining here in beautiful Seattle. And so Pilot Sport Cup tires on a cold, wet day are not ideal. So this car's got the Eagle F1, the Goodyears, which should be a better choice for at least somewhat spirited driving in the wet. I'm joined here today by my friend David Charles, who I've known actually since grade school. And a few years ago, I talked David into a 991.2 Carrera T, and he's been enjoying that for the last 3 years. So ran into him today, and I said, "Hey, how would you like to drive a new 992 Carrera T?" And of course, he just wasn't that interested.
Who would say no?
Oh,
Who would say no?
right? But really, I wanted a perspective because what we get so often on these internet reviews is, you know, people drive a car for 5 minutes and they tell you they know everything there is to know about it. But who better to tell you about how a car feels than a gentleman who spent 3 years driving it? And so even better than my opinion, I'm going to be curious what David has to say.
And I'm looking forward to trying it out. It's absolutely beautiful interior here. I like the updates that have happened.
Yeah. I mean, certainly from an aesthetic, infotainment, technology perspective, the 992, at least on surface, seems like a pretty big update. In terms of driving, however, they actually didn't change the spec a whole lot. They went from 370 horsepower to a whopping 379.
Ooh.
I think we're going to feel those 9 horsepower today,
Sure.
Dave.
I can't wait to see it.
More than anything, it'll be interesting. You didn't get a chance to drive it, but you know, having freshly driven that GT3 Touring, the thing about that car, it feels like a real sense of occasion. And so the question I have in my head, you know, original MSRP on this car was about $135. The MSRP on that GT3 Touring just north of $230,000. So is it worth an extra $100,000? So, but my initial impressions of the car compared to the GT3, and I say this really in a good way, it's just got a little bit of isolation that the GT3 doesn't have. The GT3 is very hard-edged. Right off the bat, this would be an easier car to live with on a daily basis. The other thing is, I haven't had a chance to really jump deep into the throttle yet, but certainly from, you know, at the 2,500 RPM, the turbocharged motor has every bit as much torque, if not more, than that normally aspirated motor. Doesn't sound quite as good, but from a performance standpoint, super smooth. We have not hit braking on this car. We've got 785 miles, so I did promise my friend Gary, I said, okay, I'll be well behaved. I'll keep it below 5,000, which is a little hard to do.
I understand.
Because it
Wants to
go. Got the nice rev match in sport mode. And again, not pushing it too hard, but harder than I would actually push the car with the sport cups on it, that's for sure. On kind of a wet road. It's got some nice burble on overrun there. Brake feel doesn't have quite the immediacy of the feel of the GT3, but it also doesn't have the carbon brakes, so. Oh, that's a good car.
Sounds pretty.
You know, it's so funny. I'm predominantly a classic Porsche owner. But I have to tell you, I would really enjoy driving this car on a regular basis. Talk about a driver's car. And I think that's really what the Carrera T is. It's a driver's car. Yeah, there's faster cars, there's more capable cars, but really you just want a car that speaks to you. Now we get to see what David thinks. Stay tuned.
All right. Okay. Wow. So definitely first impressions, it feels bigger, and maybe it's because of the way that the dash is laid out, and from the driver's seat. Engine feels every bit as peppy. Transmission feels smooth, but I'm impressed by the how it's holding the road. It's not as rough.
It seems like they did a better job balancing the dampening on the car. Like it doesn't get as upset kind of mid-corner, but it's been a while since I've driven a 99, so I'm curious to go drive your car. And
kind of back to back and get a sense.
Yeah. Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that is kind of fun to do, isn't it?
It's funny.
Kick it into sport and let it talk.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, I know it's a, quote, better car as a PDK, but you got to get the manual.
I agree.
Yeah.
It's more fun to engage with the car like that. That's my opinion. I'm not worried about setting lap times or anything like that. I'm just having fun and enjoying driving the whole experience.
And what's kind of funny, too, kind of is in the automotive space, oftentimes we wax poetically about cars of the past, and we say, well, gosh, if only we knew at the time. And I kind of firmly believe the cars that we're going to say, if we only knew, are going to be these Carrera T models. Because horsepower is so cheap these days. I mean, heck, we can buy, 800 horsepower family sedans. I mean, your daily drivers are Rivian, which is a faster, I don't want to say it's a car, it's an SUV, if you will. So speed is cheap, and so it's the visceral experience that you want. Oh, dear gosh.
Wow.
We got like a car on fire, everyone. If you're seeing that in the videotape, that's impressive. We do not want to follow him, so
I don't think we will.
to avoid that, we're going to go left here, David,
Okay.
because normally I would say let's go back, it's a fun road, but we're going to avoid that. So we'll go hard left.
Hard left, yep.
Oh, my.
There we go.
That was almost our last day of the Carrera T.
Yes,
Sorry, Gary.
That would have been not good.
One advantage of a performance car is you can take evasive action. Sometimes you need that.
It's hard. I mean, I don't know how he didn't see us.
Yeah.
His color does stand out a little bit.
It's a discreet color. I think that's what it was.
Obviously, I think the big thing, the biggest things I notice is sitting from the driver's seat. It feels like a bigger car. Just I think bigger cabin area. Obviously, the improved layout is super noticeable in terms of the upgraded, electronics and everything. Steering still feels pretty similar. I can tell here in a corner. Steering feels very similar. And I feel like the suspension is a little, like you say, it seems to be a little, it eats up the road a little bit better, not quite as rough, maybe as raw as in mine. Yeah, and the shifts are just real smooth too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I appreciate too is 300, almost 380 horsepower is certainly not underpowered by any means. You can sort of work the car. It's not overwhelming. No aspect of the car overwhelms one or another piece of it.
Just well balanced.
And that's the thing about driving a sports car. I mean, I think people sometimes confuse outright speed. I know when I was younger, I always assumed that the more powerful car was going to be the better car. So I'm a slow learner, and so one of the things I used to just think, well, gosh, if 380 horsepower is good, 500, of course,
it's got to be better.
Is better. And what I've actually learned is that sometimes more is just more, and sometimes it's too much for its given application or totality of the sort of device or machine. And so, sometimes I find these cars, that are kind of a sweet spot.
Doesn't overwhelm any one area, and more importantly, doesn't overwhelm the driver.
Yeah.
For those of us who are, newer on the ownership spectrum.
Yeah, as an aside, I'll put my little plug in. Everyone should go to the Porsche Experience Center and take a driving course. But yeah, if I was walking into a new Porsche store, and before you guys yell at me online, I know you can't just walk in and get one of these cars. So if you're blessed enough to have these cars, you know, that you have an allocation, you know, is the GT3 worth an additional almost $100,000 over the T? I think that all depends on what you like. It all depends on how you're going to use the car. It probably depends a little bit on your financial situation. Depends on, again, how you're going to use the car. So to me, if this is going to be my one and only Porsche, it's going to kind of do double duty as my fun car and my everyday car, I think this car strikes the right balance. If I have, maybe I've got another fun car in my stable and I want a car that feels like it has a sense of occasion, I think the GT3 gives you a sense of occasion. When you start that car up, you know, women and children cry. I mean, it
They notice you.
feels like you're 10 and it's Christmas morning and you're getting into your stocking. You know, it has that sense about it. But weirdly enough, I have a few cars in my garage that fit that description, and I almost sometimes feel like they're a little too precious to use.
Too special.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, and so
You probably wouldn't want to drive them in a rain like today.
exactly, I felt a little bit guilty, and so having a car that you can use on a regular, and it feels special enough that you're excited to own it, but not so precious you feel like you have to save it. There's something to be said for that.
To your point, it's the sweet spot for what you're looking for, right? Every use case and every driver has different needs, and just find the one that speaks to you and hits your sweet spot.
Yeah. So, $1 million question. So you have a 2018 Cayman T manual. I think its original build spec was around 115, give or take. So in today's market, they've held up really well. It's probably call it $100,000 car today. So, camera's asking you, would you go down to Porsche today and plunk down another $35,000 to own this car? Or would you be perfectly content with the 991.2 GT or Carrera T in your garage?
Well, I would say in terms of the mechanicals and everything, I'm absolutely happy with my Carrera T. I do love this color. I might think about switching out from the silver. Yep. But I think, you know, if I had one choice, I think I would probably stay with my T.
Yeah. That's really honest feedback, and I think that's what we were looking for. I think the cars are more similar than dissimilar. I think some people try to make a bigger gap than is here. Well, and we're back, and so this is going to be a lot of fun. So now Gary's going to get a chance to drive the 991.2 and think, well, did he waste $35,000?
I can't wait to find out.
Yeah, well, this will be
Looking forward to
interesting. I will say this has the best rev limiter in the business, Gary. You hardly know when you're bouncing off of it.
That is a beautiful car.
Well, everyone, I just jumped out of the 992 that belongs to Gary. Thank you, Gary, for letting me drive your not even fully broken in car
Not yet.
Now I'm getting to drive a fully broken in 991.2 Carrera T with my friend David. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Right away, my first impression, the one thing that struck me is good, bad, or indifferent. The interior in this car seems 10 years older than a 992. I mean, and not in a bad way, but just it looks very
It feels
dated.
a little tighter, too.
The dash actually feels almost like it sits a little bit higher, but the car feels narrower, but it really isn't when you actually measure it. I do like the seats better in the 992, feel just a little bit more cozy. Steering wheel is almost the same. Shift feel, at least sitting here, very similar. So let's go drive and see what we think. So Gary, I know you've had your car just a few months now, right?
Correct.
Kind of give me your initial impressions of the car so far.
Well, the dimensions just seem a little smaller to me. It's a little more intimate, maybe because the console seems a little higher to me. But it seems very familiar. It's not that different a vehicle. Makes a lot of nice sounds.
They certainly have mastered that, haven't they? Well, right away, one of the things I was really appreciative about driving the other car, and it holds true on this car as well, as while we have a performance tire, in this case it's the Pirelli P0s, we're not running a Sport Cup. The Sport Cup is a little greasy on this 45-degree wet day here in Seattle.
Do you think this feels a little stiffer?
Yeah, I'll be interested when we get a little bit more of a secondary road, but suspension compliance on the 992, really, really good. The other thing right away, a lot more tire noise in this car.
It is louder. I noticed that right off. Yeah.
Actually, kind of a shocking difference.
Considering the Ruby Stone car has the lightweight glass
Oh, okay, yeah.
and no insulation,
Yeah.
or lightweight insulation. I wonder if this has lightweight glass.
I can't remember the spec on this car or not. I'll have to answer that question when we get back and look at the spec. But yeah, that's actually the first most noticeable thing.
This is quite a bit louder now that we go up to speed a little.
You know, the thing about the GT3 Touring, and this is what I said earlier in the video, is that the term I would use is that car has a sense of occasion. It feels special.
Oh,
it feels like I'm 10 years old and it's Christmas morning and I'm opening my stocking, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that can cut both ways, I think, because it feels like a sense of occasion. So I almost feel like it'd be like a little bauble I only want to have every so often. It's kind of like when you have a great bottle of booze or something and you want to save that for a special occasion. It doesn't feel like an everyday whiskey. I know that sounds like a ridiculous idea.
No, with old Porsches that I've had, I feel the same way. And then the occasion hardly ever feels special enough.
Yeah.
You kind of keep elevating the occasion to pretty soon the car never leaves the garage.
Yeah. The other thing is I really like, for a daily car, the power delivery on the turbocharged car, which I normally wouldn't say because I'm a normally aspirated person. That's kind of my bend. I have a couple turbocharged cars in my collection, and they're towards the lower end of my passion, I guess would be a way to put it. But torque is really what makes cars effortless to drive on the daily basis. So when you're really driving the car aggressively, I love the sound of the GT3 better. It's coarse and angry, and it's got just a hard edge to it. This car doesn't quite have that. It certainly sounds good.
It does sound good, but not scary good.
No, it doesn't have a shriek or a wail.
Yeah.
It's good, but it's an interesting difference. But I think for a car, if I was going to have this be my only car, I was commuting in it, I think this is probably a car easier to live with and I would feel more comfortable. Some of that probably has a little bit to do with the price point. I mean, I look at these cars and I think, okay, the GT3 is essentially 2x the price of this car.
Correct.
That's a pretty big difference. Yeah, it's interesting. The one thing I will say between this car and the 992, like that very same dip in the 992 didn't unsettle the car, where it kind of unsettles it a little bit here. And the steering, it just feels like it's got a little more front end grip on a 992. And as you load up the steering, it doesn't have the same, there's just a little bit of kickback on this car that
on the 992, I prefer having just a normal suspension on, but then dialing up the engine instead of making it ride harder, and then it feels a little more like it wants to skip across the surface.
Yeah.
Where this feels like the tires aren't going up and down as much. The suspension isn't working quite as much, maybe. But this still feels more special than a 991.2 normal car, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's the suspension setup on this car. I think the manual transmission goes a long way. I mean, the PDK, don't get me wrong, it's a better transmission. However, from a driver, what makes your heart skip a beat, it's this car. I mean, being able to work that and the little rev match is great. You just feel like you're kind of one with the machine.
Sure.
But yeah, this is great. You get a chance to drive it and see what you think.
Certainly.
So let's trade places.
Oh, this is manual for the seat
Yeah.
to go forward. Nice. Well, the thing I noticed right off the bat in using the car is these has the fabric straps, and on the 992 it does not have the fabric straps. But what I like about the 992 for my wife is when you pull the door opener, you just pull it over maybe a quarter or a third of an inch, and then there's an electric motor that opens the door the rest of the way.
Oh, is there? Now
Yeah.
I'm going to have to, I'm embarrassed to admit I haven't noticed that. Okay, now I'm going to have to go play with the door opener, Gary. I think the brake's over there on the left side.
Yeah.
And you previously had a 991.2
I did.
PDK career cab.
I
Or was
did, and I had a 4S Targa manual.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, see? Well, speaking to a pro here, everyone.
I wonder what the weight difference is on this versus a 992.
That is a really good question. I want to make sure I don't just speak off
Yeah.
the cuff. I think they're very, very similar, but
It feels very eager.
they are. They are just a joy to drive.
Gosh. Yeah, they're compared to, I always hate the term base 911 because that sounds depreciating, because just the base 911 is such a nice car. But just whatever Porsche does to the T does make it feel more special than the base 911.
Yeah. I mean, they're the one thing I'll give Porsche credit for. They're masters at like thinly slicing the onion, right? They somehow they make 10 or 12 tweaks, and you think, oh, that shouldn't make that big a difference, but it makes a radical difference in kind of each area.
Oh, absolutely.
Well, I shouldn't even say each area. It's almost like it's 2% here and 5% there and 1% there, but in totality, it's noticeable.
Yeah. It's like the shifting is like maybe 2% shorter in a 992, but this is excellent.
Yeah.
And I don't know why it would feel different to me, but it feels like the 992 is lighter in the front end. That the front end kind of wants to bob up and down a little bit.
You mean in this car or the?
No, the 992 feels like it's a little bit floatier or lighter, where this
interesting.
feels a little more locked down. And maybe that's because the suspension is more giving in the 992. But this to me feels pretty locked down. It's a lovely car.
Yeah. No, hopefully my wife's not watching, because I already am on lockdown. I've already bought too many cars lately, but I really would like one of these cars.
Yeah, they do feel kind of special.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to David about this. As car enthusiasts, we oftentimes look in the past and go, oh, that car was so magical. Why did we not know it at the time?
Yeah.
And I really think that the Carrera T, whether it be the 991 or the 992, is going to be that car where people say, gosh, we didn't fully appreciate how good it was in the moment.
Yeah, I think Cayman R is kind of like that.
Yeah,
If
a
people
great
are used to
example.
driving Boxsters or Caymans, and then you have the chance to drive a Cayman R, you go, huh, this feels different than those other cars.
Yeah, they've worked their secret magic, right? It's not night and day different.
No,
but
it's noticeable, but just kind of, it doesn't hit you in the face.
Yeah. And those are actually the cars sometimes that are most impressive. And I also think that's one of the reasons when we do these reviews, it's fun to sit down with owners who have spent enough seat time, because most of these reviews are written by people that drive a car for 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
Oh, then live with it.
It's different than living with it.
Yeah.
Because when you live with a car, those nuances come through. And frankly, some things that annoy you come through. You go, oh, I sure wish they would have done this differently or that. And I'll be honest, that's why I got these owners out here, because I've driven these cars plenty, but I haven't lived with them. And so you've lived with several different 991.2s. You now have the new 992, and you even have a 982 4-liter GTS, right? So,
Correct. Yeah, and they're all different. Even with a 4-liter 718 Boxster. It's got more horsepower than the T, and that feels special for a Boxster, but then when I get in the T, it just feels more special in a different way.
Yeah.
It's amazing they can have so many shared parts, but they're a different experience.
So that's not really on the script, but since we're talking about it, so you have those two cars in your garage. If you could only have one, which one's leaving the nest, Gary?
I'm going to make a lot of enemies here.
Yeah.
Because we've had a few Boxsters, and we like the Cayman R, but if I could only have one, I'd stick with the 911T.
Oh, okay.
It just feels, and I know they share a lot of parts, but they just do feel, there's something special about the 911.
Well, the final question I asked David, and we were back to this point, I said, okay, so we talked about price. This car in today's market's worth around $100,000. I think MSRP on the Ruby Star car around $135,000. So if you could trade the Ruby Star car in and put $35,000 in your pocket, would you do that trade?
Not at the age I am now.
Fair enough. I asked David the same question in reverse, and was it worth the $35,000? And frankly, he was smitten with the color, the Ruby Star.
Well, color makes a difference. That's true. Well, it's been a delight. This is a beautiful car.
Ooh. Well, this was fun.
Yeah, very familiar. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, I think this video is gonna. This is our first million viewer video. I'm serious. I think it's.
I think the Carrera Ranch is good luck.
Yeah. Well, that is really interesting to be in them both back to back. So.
What are your impressions?
Thank you, David.
My overall impressions are.
Yeah, selling right now. It's crap.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I will say, when you. I've never thought that the interior of this car looked dated, but when you jump from that immediately to this looks 10 years older.
It does.
I mean, literally 10 years old. So now that we've had the opportunity to drive both, be in both, and really experience the differences, I think a quick summary would be put this way. From a pure driving standpoint, they are much more similar than dissimilar. Power delivery, exhaust note, feel of all the various inputs, very, very similar. I would say not much distinguishing difference. If I had to pick one thing about the two cars from a driving perspective that I noted, it was steering feel and steering stability when really being pushed, particularly in the front end feel. A little bit of an improvement in the 992, but we're getting into some shades of gray here. So if your number one focus is driving experience, I think either car is going to deliver on the Porsche promise of an unparalleled driving experience. In terms of some other things that differentiate the two cars, some of them are going to be opinion-based. Styling, for example. Some people really feel like the 991.2 really got the styling genre right, whereas some people appreciate the updates with the 992. I'm going to leave that up to your own opinion. And then there's a couple other factors. Price. Generally, right now in today's market, good early 991.2 Carrera Ts are trading for around $100,000, give or take. And depending on how you option a new 992 Carrera T, they're going to run between $130,000 and $160,000. But of course, you get potentially a new car or a very, very late model car for those different dollars. And of course, the other thing that's going to vary between car to car is going to be colors and options. We know Porsche loves to sell options and color. So I would say between these two cars, one of the things that really made a difference was the Ruby Star Neo versus the GT Silver. If you're a more discreet, under the radar kind of driver, something like a GT Silver is going to be more appealing than something that's a little bit more extroverted, like a Ruby Star Neo. Again, highly preferential depending on the individual. And then the other big difference is the infotainment and the interior. The 992 does feel appreciably newer, much higher quality in terms of the entertainment experience or the infotainment, if you will. But again, it depends on what your priorities are. I'm more of a driver. I spent a lot of time in old classic Porsche.
So infotainment's very low on my list. However, focus groups tell us people really care about that stuff. So if I were to boil it all down, it just comes down, number one, to which car you prefer, styling, options, color, those kinds of things. But from a driving experience perspective, I think either cars are going to be an amazing choice. And of course, we cannot forget the 992 GT3 Touring. If you can afford the additional $100,000 or $150,000 potentially to span the gap, you can't go wrong with that car. With that said, would I personally spend the difference between those two cars? If I was not going to take the car to the track, I likely would not. If I wanted to have some track time or I was going to drive the car regularly north of 0.8, then probably the additional investment in the GT3 makes sense. The good news is, no matter what choice you make, none of them are bad. Get out there and drive.